The guns had finally fallen silent. For the first time in 6 long years, Europe exhaled. The air, heavy with smoke and ash, seemed almost unfamiliar without the constant roar of artillery. Streets once alive with the chaos of battle were now eerily empty, their silence a hollow echo of lives lost. Buildings, once proud and towering, now stood as skeletal reminders, crumbling walls, shattered windows, and scorched rooftops. Yet, amidst this quiet, there was no peace. Not yet, because though the war had ended, hunger had not. Families wandered the streets, their eyes hollow, their hands clutching whatever scraps they could find. Mothers led children over broken cobblestones, scavenging for food that seemed always just out of reach. The ration lines, long and winding, snaked through towns like rivers of desperation. Men and women waited for hours, their faces etched with fatigue, hope fraying like worn fabric at the edges. They were survivors of a war that promised freedom but delivered scarcity. In one ruined apartment building, a father sifted through the remnants of a burned pantry, finding nothing but scorched tins and crumbs of bread. His children, shivering in threadbare coats, watched him silently, understanding more than he wished they did. Across the street, a young woman knelt beside a pile of rubble, her fingers trembling as she lifted a single half-rotten potato to her lips. A fleeting taste, bitter yet comforting, was all that separated her from collapse. It was a paradox that no one could escape. Peace had come, but survival had not. The air smelled of frost and decay, a bitter reminder that the end of bombs did not mean the end of suffering. Every corner of the city whispered the same cruel truth: the war might be over, but its hunger lingered, seeping into homes and stomachs alike. And yet, even in the depths of despair, life clawed its way forward. Neighbors shared what little they had, and children, too weak to play, learned the art of improvisation, turning discarded scraps into meals, discarded crates into beds. There was an unspoken resilience in their movements, a quiet defiance against the bleakness that threatened to swallow them whole, but that resilience was fragile. Rumors of stolen rations and growing desperation rippled through the streets like wildfire. Hunger sharpened tempers and eroded trust. People who had survived bombings now faced another enemy, one invisible but relentless. It could not be fought with rifles or tanks. It could only be endured, and so Europe faced its first true test of peace. For in the silence of the guns, another storm had begun, a storm of empty stomachs, cold nights, and the relentless question that haunted every soul: how do you survive when survival itself has become a battle? Some would endure, some would not. And in this forgotten winter, every breath, every scrap of food, every act of small courage would mark the difference between life and oblivion. The war had left more than rubble. It had left ghosts. Not the ones that whispered in the night, but the ones etched into faces, the ones that haunted empty homes and abandoned streets. Families returned, expecting warmth and the comfort of normalcy, but found only silence. Doors hung crooked, windows gaped open to the winter wind, and furniture, if it remained, was broken, burned, or stolen. In a small village on the outskirts of a once bustling town, a mother and her 2 children arrived at what had once been their home. She pushed the door open with a trembling hand, and the sound of it scraping against the floor echoed through the empty rooms. Dust rose like smoke, the furniture gone, leaving only cold, bare floors. The children's eyes widened in shock, the joy of peace swallowed by the harsh realization that their home, like so many others, no longer existed. Orphaned children wandered streets with nothing but hope to cling to, their small bodies bent against the cold, their stomachs hollow. Some clung to one another for warmth. Others roamed alone, eyes darting at shadows for both danger and food. The streets, once filled with laughter, now echoed with a silence that pressed against the soul. Hunger had become a companion to trauma, a constant reminder that even survival was fragile. Returning soldiers faced their own battles. They came back expecting to be greeted as heroes, yet were met with empty homes, lost families, and ration cards that barely sustained life. One young man trudged through his hometown, the snow crunching beneath his boots, only to find the local pharmacy burned to the ground, medicine gone, and neighbors too weak to help. The injuries of war had not ended on the battlefield. They had shifted into a new front, one fought with sickness, cold, and relentless hunger. Infrastructure collapse only worsened the plight. Roads were impassable, railways destroyed, and bridges had crumbled, isolating communities from the aid they desperately needed. Relief supplies trickled in, delayed by snow and chaos, leaving families to survive as best they could. Makeshift markets sprung up in ruins, but prices were impossible for the desperate. Every day was a struggle to find food, warmth, and basic medicine. The psychological toll was invisible but severe. Survivors shuffled through their days in a haze of fear, guilt, and exhaustion. Parents struggled with the shame of what they could not provide. Children wept silently for the lives they had lost. And beneath the surface, a quiet anger simmered, a sense that the war might have ended, but the suffering was far from over. Yet amidst this bleakness, moments of humanity emerged. A neighbor shared a single loaf of bread with a widow. Children found scraps of firewood to keep each other warm. Soldiers helped rebuild fences, clear debris, and transport what little food could be spared. In the shadows of trauma, resilience flickered like a fragile candle, small but defiant, but it was a delicate flame. Rumors spread of stolen supplies, fights broke out over the smallest portions, and fear of betrayal lingered in every alleyway. Every act of kindness was weighed against suspicion. Every step outside carried the weight of uncertainty. The war may have ended in guns and tanks, but in the shattered communities across Europe, the battle had only changed form. This was a winter of ghosts and hunger, of memory and survival, where the scars of the past met the demands of the present. Families, soldiers, and children alike faced the stark truth. To endure this peace, they would have to confront not only the bitter cold and empty stomachs, but the invisible wounds that war had etched deep into their hearts. And somewhere in the distance, beyond broken rooftops and icy streets, the next storm was gathering, the relentless grip of winter. Where hunger and despair would test the limits of human endurance, the winter came like a thief in the night. It crept across shattered rooftops into broken windows, and seeped into the very bones of those already worn thin by hunger and grief. Europe had survived the guns, the bombs, the marching armies, but it had not survived the cold. Not yet. In the ruined heart of a city that had once been alive with music, children huddled in doorways, their lips blue and their small hands trembling. Mothers wrapped tattered coats around them, but it was never enough. Fathers scavenged for firewood, tearing apart broken furniture, window frames, even the floors themselves to keep a spark alive in the icy apartments. Smoke rose weakly from chimneys that once drew the warmth of hearths, carrying with it the scent of despair and desperation. Rations were paltry. A handful of bread, a thin soup of water, and whatever vegetables could be found, sometimes spoiled, sometimes scarce. The food that arrived from relief organizations was slow and irregular. Trucks stuck in snowdrifts, roads impassable, bridges collapsed. Help was there in theory, but inaccessible in practice. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, and it gnawed at the spirit even harder. Every meal was a struggle, every morsel a prize, and every person's survival a gamble against frost and famine alike. With desperation came moral compromise. A mother stole a loaf from a neighbor's pile, her eyes wide with shame as she handed it to her children. In another street, a man bartered medicine for food, swapping pills that could save lives for a crust of bread that could save one. Theft, deceit, and survival had become intertwined. The streets were no longer just the remnants of war, they had become a battleground of human instinct. Who could blame them? Hunger had sharpened their minds, sharpened their fear, sharpened their resolve. Children bore the brunt of the winter. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and the wails of those too weak to endure the cold echoed through empty courtyards. Families tried to shield them, carrying them on shoulders, burying them under blankets and rags, but the chill was relentless. One little boy, no more than 7, pressed himself against his mother's chest in the shadow of a ruined doorway, shivering so violently that his teeth rattled. His mother whispered prayers she no longer believed, stroking his hair, willing him to survive the night. Survival had become a cruel lottery, and the dice were rolled by winter itself. In the markets, moral ambiguity thrived alongside scarcity. Black market traders moved silently through snow-packed alleys, selling stolen supplies at prices that were nearly as deadly as the cold. Families, hungry and desperate, had to decide whether to trade their remaining possessions for food or risk hunger another day. A loaf of bread could save a life tonight but leave them vulnerable tomorrow. Every decision was a gamble, every choice a moral weight. There were no right answers, only survival. Even the strongest among the survivors felt the weight of exhaustion. Soldiers returning from the front lines, their uniforms tattered and faces hollow, now fought a war of endurance. They helped neighbors lift beams from collapsed homes, shared the last scraps of bread with children, but every act of kindness came at a personal cost. Their own bodies ached, their own stomachs ached, yet they pressed on, driven by memory and duty, hope and stubbornness. The nights were the hardest. Snow covered the ruins, muffling sound and masking danger. Wolves, once scared away by humanity's presence, crept closer to towns, hunting rats and whatever scraps they could find. Fires burned low in the rubble, illuminating the gaunt faces of people who refused to sleep, who feared that if they closed their eyes for even a moment, the cold or hunger might take them before morning. And still, amidst the hardship, there were glimmers of ingenuity. Families built makeshift stoves from broken metal, sharing warmth in small circles. Children gathered snow to melt for water, or found hollowed-out logs to sleep in. One old man, his hands cracked and bleeding, taught neighbors to preserve whatever food they could find, slicing thinly, drying it in the smoke of weak fires, stretching each meal across days. Survival had become an art, honed with desperation and guided by hope that refused to die, but the moral cost of winter weighed heavily. Rumors spread of entire households disappearing, of food stolen in the dead of night, of violence erupting in the streets over the smallest scraps. Hunger made strangers suspicious of one another, and neighbors, once united in the shared terror of war, now eyed each other with quiet wariness. Every step outside was a negotiation with danger, every interaction a careful calculation of trust and need. The boundaries between right and wrong had blurred into a fog as dense as the frost that settled over rooftops. And yet, even in the coldest nights, even when frostbitten fingers could barely grasp a spoon, life persisted. Children sang quietly to each other in the ruins, their voices soft against the howling wind. Mothers whispered stories of better days. Soldiers laughed quietly over shared meals, bitter but sustaining, refusing to let despair claim them entirely. It was a fragile defiance, a fragile hope, but it existed, a stubborn refusal to be consumed by the winter. Winter was Europe's unspoken enemy now, relentless and unforgiving. It tested every ounce of strength, every shred of morality, every flicker of hope. The war had ended, but survival in its aftermath was proving to be an equally brutal campaign. And in the long nights, as people huddled in rubble and ruins, staring at the cold sky, the question burned quietly in every mind: how much can the human spirit endure before it breaks? Some would bend, some would break, but others, those few who clung to hope, would endure. Even as the icy grip of Europe's forgotten winter tightened with each passing day, hunger had become its own war, one that no one could surrender from. The winter had hardened, and so had the hearts of those it touched. Streets that had once carried the laughter of children now echoed with silence, broken only by the shuffling of weary feet and the occasional desperate cry. Families, neighbors, friends, even siblings found themselves driven to acts they would have once called unthinkable. In a small apartment, a father stared at the single loaf of bread in his hand. His youngest daughter's eyes were wide and pleading, her lips blue from the cold, her small stomach pressing against her frailty. The older son crouched in the corner, silent but calculating, understanding that one slice might save one sibling while condemning another. Outside, the faint sound of scuffling reached them, neighbors desperate for any scraps. Black market traders moving through the shadows, hawking stolen food at prices no one could afford. The father's hands shook as he weighed his options. Give the bread to the little girl, ensuring her survival for one more day, but leaving his older child to hunger, or split it, condemning both to weakness and despair. He closed his eyes, the moral lines he once held so clearly now dissolving in the icy wind of necessity. Survival had stripped away pride, mercy, and certainty beyond the apartment. The streets themselves had turned into arenas of quiet violence. Families scavenged in ruins, their desperation making them bold. A woman grabbed a loaf from another mother's basket, her eyes pleading for forgiveness that would never come. Children were sent out alone, hunting for food in ruins where danger lurked, not just in frostbite or collapsing buildings, but in the hands of those driven mad by want. Some vanished entirely, swallowed by the cold or taken by others who saw survival as a zero-sum game. Black markets thrived in the shadows. Men and women who had once been ordinary citizens now acted as traders of life and death. A spoonful of soup became a luxury. A crust of bread could be traded for warmth or for medicine, or for information about where the next shipment of supplies might arrive. The morality of these exchanges was murky. Those who participated did so out of need, not greed, but the lines between necessity and exploitation blurred quickly. A child begged for scraps while another stole them to survive. The war had ended, but the battle for survival was just beginning. Even the communal bonds that had offered glimmers of hope during the first bitter weeks of winter began to fray. Families argued over food, neighbors accused each other of theft, and once quiet streets filled with whispered threats. Every interaction was charged with suspicion. Every glance carried the weight of fear. And yet there were moments of remarkable courage, parents giving up their portion to a neighbor's sick child, strangers sharing a crust of bread. A hand offered in silent solidarity, but these were fleeting, fragile acts, often overshadowed by the pervasive hunger that drove people to the brink. In one ruined building, a mother faced the cruelest choice she could imagine. Her son was sick, feverish from hunger and cold, while her daughter's cries demanded the last of her energy. Across the street, a neighbor's son had collapsed in the snow, begging for even a single bite. She clutched the meager bread she had scavenged, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed to save her children, but another part of her, the part forged by months of famine, whispered that sharing even with strangers was survival in its truest sense. The decision weighed on her like a mountain of ice. Give and risk everything or keep and condemn. In the shadows, black market traders watched. They had seen countless acts of desperation, calculated every choice, and profited from the moral cracks in human behavior. Hunger had transformed the city into a labyrinth of ethical traps. There were no heroes here, only survivors, each making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The paradox of post-war peace had never been more apparent. The guns had fallen silent, yes, but the human cost persisted in sharper, subtler forms. Hunger reshaped morality, stripped away certainty, and demanded that survival become the measure of all decisions. The city groaned under the weight of suffering, each step a negotiation with cold, with fear, with hunger itself. By nightfall, the mother made her choice. She tore the bread into small pieces, giving some to her children, some to the collapsed boy across the street. She could not save everyone, but she could preserve what was human in herself, what remained of her compassion. Around her, others made similar choices or failed to. The winter would judge them all, indifferent to intention or outcome, and as the city settled into another long, merciless night, the lesson became clear: peace was not freedom. Survival was not safety. Hunger was a force that reshaped human life, bending wills, breaking hearts, and demanding choices no one should ever have to make. In this forgotten winter, every act of love was weighed against necessity. Every moral decision was a battle, and every heartbeat was a victory, against a world that had turned cold in more ways than one. After months of relentless cold and hunger, a faint light began to pierce the shadows of the ruined city. Relief trucks, though slow and scarce, finally arrived. Red Cross workers and Allied aid convoys brought what little they could spare: thin soup, canned goods, blankets, and medicine. For the first time in months, families felt a cautious glimmer of hope. Fragile as frost on a winter window. In the streets, children pressed their faces against the crates of supplies. their eyes wide, disbelief etched into every feature. Mothers clutched the parcels to their chests, trembling not just from cold, but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of security. Fathers, weary and hollow-eyed, helped unload the aid, their muscles stiff from months of scavenging and toil. The city's ruins suddenly buzzed with movement, a tentative dance of survival transformed into tentative relief. Communities began to gather. Neighbors shared blankets, divided food, and looked out for the weakest, those who had been too ill, too small, or too afraid to fend for themselves. The mother who had faced impossible choices days before now watched her children eat a warm soup, their laughter cracking like glass in the cold air. It was a fragile sound, easily shattered by the wind or the reminder of what had been lost, but it was real. It was life. Even soldiers returning to homes that were no longer theirs lent their strength to the effort. They helped clear rubble for temporary shelters, carried firewood through icy streets, and treated those too weak to rise. In every act there was a quiet heroism, not the valor of battlefields, but the courage of endurance, of rebuilding, of refusing to let despair claim the soul entirely, yet hope did not erase the scars. Hunger had left its mark on bodies and minds alike. Children were thin, their limbs brittle. Mothers carried the anxiety of months without enough to eat. Fathers bore the silent weight of guilt over choices they had made to survive. Still, even in their fragility, there was resilience. The simple act of sharing a loaf of bread, of lighting a fire in a ruined home, of helping a neighbor across snow-covered streets became victories in themselves. Small communities began to reform, holding together with shared effort and solidarity. Underground gardens, makeshift stoves, and improvised water collection became symbols of human ingenuity and perseverance. People who had once scavenged in silence now helped each other navigate a harsh, uneven recovery. Even amidst ruined buildings and frost-bitten streets, life began to push through the cracks, and yet the winter had left its lessons. No one could forget the hunger, the moral compromises, the moments when survival had outweighed conscience. Aid brought relief, but it did not erase the past. The fear, the cold, and the scarcity lingered like shadows in corners, reminding everyone that peace was a fragile promise, not an absolute gift. Still, that fragile hope was enough. Enough to spark smiles in children's eyes. Enough to ignite courage in parents' hearts. Enough to remind the city that, even in a forgotten winter, humanity endured. And in those small, quiet victories, the sharing of a meal, the warmth of a blanket, the rebuilding of a street, the first true signs of recovery, began to shine through the cold. Spring never arrived in a single day. Instead, it crept slowly through the ruins, warming the frozen earth bit by bit, coaxing buds from the skeletal trees, melting the stubborn snow that had blanketed Europe's forgotten cities. Food, though still rationed, became more consistent. Relief convoys arrived with slightly fuller shipments, and local markets began to reappear amid the rubble. Yet the echoes of winter remained, etched into every face, every body, and every home still in ruins. Families moved cautiously, still wary of theft, still haunted by the months of scarcity that had reshaped their instincts. A mother pressed her child close as they navigated streets littered with debris, her eyes scanning the shadows for danger that no longer came in the form of gunfire, but in the form of lingering hunger, exhaustion, and mistrust. The lessons of winter had been cruel and unrelenting, and their mark would not fade overnight. In one small neighborhood, survivors began to rebuild homes with their own hands. A father hammered together a window frame from salvaged wood, while his teenage daughter swept the floors, clearing shards of glass and rubble. Every nail, every plank, every carefully salvaged item was a testament to human resilience, a refusal to be defeated by cold, famine, or loss. Across the street, an elderly woman planted a small garden in a patch of sunlit soil, coaxing green shoots from the earth as if reclaiming life itself. The streets gradually filled with life again. Children laughed cautiously, their voices a little hesitant at first, as if fearing that happiness might be stolen away again. In the town square, neighbors gathered to share news of those who had survived, to mourn quietly for those who had vanished, and to recount stories of courage that had carried them through the long nights. Every story was a thread in a fragile tapestry of survival, weaving together grief, endurance, and hope. Returning soldiers confronted a different kind of battlefield. Their uniforms were worn, their bodies scarred, but it was the unseen wounds that weighed heaviest. Flashbacks of bombed streets, orphaned children, and impossible moral choices haunted their waking hours. Some found comfort in labor clearing debris, distributing food, helping rebuild schools and homes, but others struggled silently, their memories tightening like winter frost around their hearts. And yet, in helping their communities recover, they found a measure of purpose that no medal or parade could ever have given them. Reuniting with lost relatives became both joyous and heartbreaking. One man found his sister living in a makeshift shelter, thin and pale, her eyes reflecting both relief and lingering fear. They embraced, yet the memory of months apart lingered in the weight of their hug, in the quiet acknowledgement of the hunger, the cold, and the despair they had endured alone. In every reunion, there was both healing and the reminder of what had been lost, a bittersweet paradox of post-war life. Poverty persisted, even as the frost receded. Food, though more abundant, was still rationed. Families who had survived the harshest months of winter now faced the slow grind of rebuilding livelihoods. Men returned to work where factories and businesses had been damaged. Women cultivated gardens and cobbled together small trades. Survival had required ingenuity during famine, and now it demanded adaptation in a world that was still fragile and uncertain. Psychological scars ran deep. Mothers flinched at sudden noises, children cried at shadows reminiscent of ruins, and survivors sometimes recoiled from human contact, their trust fractured by months of fear. Yet in the midst of these scars, small victories emerged. A neighbor shared bread without hesitation. A father let his children play in the sunlight without fear. Communities began to rebuild social bonds as carefully as they rebuilt homes. Recognizing that life required more than mere survival, it required connection. Courage and hope. Education began to return. One room at a time. Teachers gathered children in partially destroyed schoolhouses, using salvaged materials to reconstruct lessons. Even with empty stomachs and cold fingers, the act of learning became a symbol of recovery, a claim to the future, a statement that life would continue despite the shadows of famine and war. Children who had scavenged for scraps now learned letters and numbers, discovering that survival could coexist with knowledge and growth, yet not all wounds healed evenly. Some families never recovered the members they had lost. Some children carried permanent effects from malnutrition, and some adults were haunted by decisions that had felt necessary to keep their loved ones alive. In the quiet moments, the winter of hunger lingered as a memory, a reminder that peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the courage to face what comes next. Even as streets filled with tentative smiles and gardens began to bloom, Europe's cities still bore the scars of the war and famine. Rebuilding was slow and painstaking, but with each repaired roof, each shared meal, each regained laugh, the survivors took back a small piece of their world. They adapted, they endured, and they remembered, and in the long thaw, amid the mixture of relief and lingering pain, a truth became clear. Survival was not simply about endurance of body, but endurance of spirit. The winter had tested the limits of humanity, but the first signs of recovery revealed the resilience that had carried people through the darkest months. Life would never be the same, yet it was still possible to live. In the quiet evenings, as smoke rose from small fires and children played in sunlit streets, survivors reflected on what they had endured. They had faced hunger, frost, and moral compromise. They had lost loved ones, homes, and certainty. And yet they had adapted. They had rebuilt. They had survived. The long thaw was slow, but it carried a promise. Even after the harshest winter, even after the greatest suffering, life could begin again. The winter that followed the guns was a silence that spoke louder than any battlefield. It was a season of invisible wounds, of hunger that gnawed beneath the skin, and of quiet courage that went unnoticed by history. Europe had celebrated its peace, had cheered the surrender of armies and the fall of tyranny, but in the streets, homes, and hearts of millions, The war had never truly ended. In the ruins of cities, memories lingered like smoke over the rooftops. Mothers remembered the nights spent keeping children warm with nothing but scraps of cloth. Fathers remembered the moral choices, the thefts, the impossible decisions made to preserve life. Children, who had scavenged for survival, carried lessons learned too early: how to find food in rubble, how to trust only cautiously, and how to hope when hope itself seemed a luxury. Every face, every body, every scar told a story that would never appear in headlines or history books. Those who endured the forgotten winter were not heroes in the traditional sense. They carried no medals, their names were not inscribed on monuments, and their deeds were invisible to the world beyond their neighborhoods. And yet their courage was profound. A child who offered a crumb to a stranger. A mother who shared the last scrap of bread despite her own hunger. A neighbor who carried firewood for those too weak to lift it. These were acts of quiet heroism, small sparks that illuminated the darkness of a winter the world had already tried to forget. Time moved forward, slowly reclaiming streets from rubble, planting gardens where once only ash lay, rebuilding homes and schools where laughter had been silenced. But the memory of hunger lingered like a shadow. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of lost siblings, vanished neighbors, and meals that were once life itself. The frost of winter had carved more than the landscape, it had etched its presence into human hearts. And even as spring returned and food became more plentiful, those lessons remained. Peace alone could not heal, could not restore what had been lost, and could not erase the months of struggle that had defined survival. In villages and cities across Europe, families rebuilt. Children returned to schools, laughter began to echo again, and markets filled with color and the scent of fresh bread. Soldiers resumed their lives, neighbors extended hands of friendship once more, and communities began to weave the delicate threads of normalcy. And yet, underneath it all, the memory of winter persisted. A silent testament to endurance and human strength, the winter's legacy was not merely suffering. It was the revelation of resilience. It was a demonstration that life could continue even when all the familiar anchors had been stripped away. The human spirit, fragile and battered, could adapt, could persist, and could find light in the midst of despair. It was the endurance of the ordinary that became extraordinary. The father who refused to give up on his family. The mother who sacrificed herself to feed her children. The neighbor who extended compassion when suspicion would have been safer. And yet, for every act of courage, there had been loss. Families never reunited. Children carried scars they would bear forever. Lives were shortened by hunger and cold. History, in its rush to commemorate victory, had overlooked these truths. The stories of survival were overshadowed by tales of battles and generals, of cities liberated and treaties signed. But those who endured hunger understood a different kind of victory of life itself. A quiet, uncelebrated triumph against circumstances that sought to destroy hope. Looking back, the winter after the guns offers a lesson for all who remember. Peace does not automatically bring prosperity. Victory does not erase suffering. The end of conflict does not guarantee that the most vulnerable will survive unscathed. And the courage of ordinary people, the kind that saves lives, preserves dignity and rebuilds communities, is often invisible to the world. Yet, it is no less real, no less significant, and no less worthy of remembrance. As the years passed, the survivors aged, carrying memories that could not be rewritten. They told stories to children and grandchildren, quietly passing down lessons of endurance, compassion, and resourcefulness. They spoke of hunger, but also of hope, of fear, but also of courage, of loss, but also of small triumphs. In these stories, the forgotten winter lived on not as a footnote to history, but as a testament to the human capacity to endure when everything seemed lost. And so, the memory of winter stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It reminds us that peace is fragile, that survival often demands extraordinary courage in ordinary lives, and that history is not just written in battles and treaties, but in the silent endurance of those who survived what the world had almost forgotten. In the ruins of Europe, Amid rebuilt streets and restored homes, the echoes of hunger remain. They whisper of a winter that tested every human limit, of lives shaped by scarcity and cold, and of hearts that refused to surrender. For those who endured, the lesson was clear, even in the harshest seasons. Even when hope is faint and the world seems indifferent, the human spirit can endure. It can survive. It can rebuild. And it can be remembered.